Hello and welcome to another edition of Veterans Corner. I'm Marshal Preston, U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel retired, and your host for today's segment. Veterans Corner is an initiative of your Westboro Veterans Advisory Board and graciously produced by our partners here at Westboro Television. The goal of Veterans Corner is to share information on topical issues that may affect our veterans, families, residents, and friends within our community. It's also an opportunity to spotlight local veterans, where we seek to share some of their experiences and stories to highlight their service and continued civic contributions to the community at large. By doing so, we hope to educate the community of the variety and breadth of experiences that veterans have, and perhaps break down some of the assumptions, biases, or stereotypes that we may hold on to, consciously or unconsciously. To that end, we're quite fortunate to have Westboro's Veteran of the Year for 2024, Mr. Jim Tepper, with us today. I'm looking forward to the conversation ahead. Jim, welcome. Congratulations on your nomination and selection for this year's Veteran of the Year. Having served with you on the Veterans Advisory Board for the last couple of years, I know that you are well deserving. You have been an incredible advocate for veterans across the community. So congrats, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I typically start just sort of looking for biographical information. Where were you raised? Did you come from a military family, siblings, etc.?
Well, I was raised in Northampton, Mass., out in the western part of the state. I went through school there on the Springfield College, which is also in the west, and was commissioned into the Marine Corps at graduation from Springfield. I had a program called the Platoon Leaders Class. I chose that with the aviation option and went on from there. So, my young years in Northampton were relatively typical for the time. I spent a lot of time in Boy Scouts, high school athletics, church activities, all which got me well prepared to go to Springfield, which is a pretty well-rounded school. And at that time was preparing a lot of people for Scout and YMCA professions. I was headed to be a Scout executive and went off into the Marine Corps and never went back to that other track. So,
And what year frame was this?
I graduated from Springfield in 1967. So if we back up, high school was 63. The dark ages for a lot of people that I speak with these days. So.
No. And did Springfield have a large sort of military-directed community?
No, they didn't. There were recruiters that came on campus. I saw them my sophomore year, and somehow that just kind of caught my attention. And the PLC program, for those that don't know it, we go through a couple of summers of training, 8 weeks apiece. I went to Quantico, and that then got me to the point where I got commissioned as a second lieutenant at graduation. And there were just two of us that were commissioned in the Marine Corps.
Okay.
And I don't remember any other branches that were commissioned, at least at the ceremonies.
Wow. Okay. Well, I think that speaks to your drive, influence, and perhaps some credit to the recruiters and the PLC program for grabbing you. So what was your degree in?
Community recreation. Prepared to go out and work in the community, and again, that happened. But I used a lot of that background for my career when I did get off of active duty.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about Quantico. If you don't mind, share with the audience sort of what that means and what that is. I think military members sort of mostly know it, but 8 weeks at Quantico.
Yeah, Quantico is, it's the home, a lot of TV watchers are going to know, it's the home for NCIS. And, it's certainly the home for the basic school for Marine officers that go through their initial training. But they've got an element where either ROTC or PLC candidates go through what's boot camp. Mm-hmm. So it's an officer boot camp similar to Paris Island or San Diego if you're looking at Marine Corps side of things.
Every Marine's a rifleman.
That's exactly right. So it was a lot of fun. Summer's warm. We hit the grinder to march. We hit the obstacle course for agility, and a few days spent out in the swamps. So it was interesting.
Any particular days or instructors that stick out in your mind?
There are, but I've tried to
Not-
push them to the back. I pushed them to the back.
Got it.
It
Okay.
was interesting.
All right, so you graduated your commission in 1967, and you had the opportunity in PLC to select for aviation.
No, I was in the aviation program. I did when
Okay.
I went through, but that was also that was in place when I went to Quantico, which of course you got DIs that are all ground types and they loved the Airedales, and so that didn't keep them from.
DIs for drill instructors, so and the ground forces like to sort of have a sibling rivalry with the aviation or the.
They do.
Yeah.
They do.
Good.
So
All right, so you commission your pathways for aviation, and where did that take you?
the Marine Corps, being part of the Navy, we used Pensacola in Pensacola, Florida, Naval Air Station down there, where both Navy and Marine Corps aviators are trained side by side, all mixed together. That was turned out to be 15 months. It got shortened by a couple of months. Those that may remember history, 67, 68, into 69 were years where there was some activity building up across the pond. And so they were pushing people a little bit faster and faster to get through training. When I left, the first two phases of basic, it used to be you get your option to go helicopters or fixed wing. There were just 0 slots in the fixed wing. They were all helicopter at the time. So
Okay.
I like to say I chose helicopters, but
Helicopters chose you as well.
that's exactly right. So through 2 or 3 different bases in Pensacola, and then once you get your wings, you go out to the fleet, as they call it. My assignment was in North Carolina. So I went to, oh, that's not true. I went to the West Coast first. I went to called Santa Ana. It's a base out there, had huge blimp hangars, left over from the blimp days. So it was about 10 miles from El Toro. Both of those fields are shut down now, but that's where the fleet was operating. So you spend a number of months in a fleet squadron getting further training, awaiting orders. So
Okay. And what type of aircraft?
I flew a CH-46, which is the tandem rotor Boeing, carries 25 troops, an external rear ramp. It's the little sister, we call it, of the CH-47 that the Army is still flying. Probably saw a number of those in the hurricane relief operations that the National Guard are flying down the Carolinas.
Yep. Okay. And how big was your squadron? How frequently are you flying as a Marine aviator?
Oh, in those days, you're flying every day. I'm going to, memory is a little bit fuzzy, probably 18 to 20 your birds in a squadron, 50, 45 pilots, something like that. A lot of different training missions. As it turned out, we were there during floods, mudslides in the early part of the year, so we spent a week out doing similar to work to what you're seeing in today's world, picking people off of houses and mountainsides. Then you go back and then you're on a training mission. It could be instrument training, could be navigation training, external training. We were supporting the ground troops down at Camp Pendleton, which is the West Coast version of Camp Lejeune here in North Carolina. And so we'd pick up the troops and give them a FAM ride. And we used to call it the wide-eyed ride because these kids would come in the ramp, sit down in the seat, we'd go off, and sometimes you'd turn a little bit left or right fast. You'd look back and the eyes were the size of the end of these cups and say, kids out of the downtown Philadelphia or central Chicago hadn't been up in a helicopter before.
And is the ramp down when you're doing this maneuver?
Oh, you put the ramp down, but the top ramp was open, and off you went. So that was what they were doing. They were training to come in, they would enter, we'd take them to a zone, they'd exit, and fan out and
Yep, do their mission.
get into their required positions. So
Okay. All right. So you were out there 10 months, a year?
I was
California?
out in the West Coast September to June, 9 months. I came back I got orders, so I had some time to come back to Florida, which is where my wife and first son, were going to be staying. Because of some family health issues, I got delayed, so I got sent to North Carolina for another 10 months. So we lived in North Carolina, and I went through a couple of 46 squadrons there. North Carolina is New River, which is the air station right next to Pendleton. So, Lejeune. My age is getting my words confused. Similar kind of training, similar kind of support of those forces. I then got orders from there to go over to Vietnam.
Okay. And prior to getting to Vietnam, Marines and their aviation certainly support Marines, but they generally get to the fight and also have a role to support the Navy. Did any of your training missions fly out to the ship and work on those?
Well, we would use the ships for carrier qual. So there was the element of going out to a helicopter carrier and landing. While I was in New River, there was no extensive support of Navy. We were supporting some other operations. We did some still hunting in North Carolina with the federal government. We did some search and rescue. We did some couple of other things that don't get mentioned. But not a lot of Navy support in where I was assigned.
Okay.
We did when we get overseas.
And at this point, you're still active duty?
Oh, it's active duty, correct.
Okay. All right, so Vietnam is ramping up, and walk us through the process of getting notified of your turn over there. Are you volunteering, or is it
No, there's no
the
volunteer.
squadron's
It's a
going?
matter of the orders. And I knew when I went to New River, I was just being delayed a while until the health issue got addressed with my wife. I got orders and I went. So it's over to San Francisco, process and go. So very similar to many, many stories people have told. You get on an American Airlines plane and, it's going to hold 200 and all 6 seats abreast from back to front, front to back, all guys doing the same thing. Go in, land one time in Honolulu to get some gas, and the next thing you know, we're in Okinawa. And so Okinawa is the processing for the Marine Corps. Pass out orders, you're going to go here, you're going to go here. I got orders to join what's called the Marine Amphibious Unit, a squadron that was stationed on a helicopter carrier, 600-foot yacht, that carried what they called a composite squadron. The composite squadron had Hueys, 46s, 53s, and Cobras. And so you've got pilots coming from other operational squadrons together. It's a mini group, as we call it in the Marine Corps. Similarly, there was 200 ground Marines, both on the carrier and on some sister ships, LPD and a carrier, troop carrier. That 4 ships were part of this MAU. So
Pretty neat.
it was interesting.
A good mix of capabilities.
Yep.
Okay.
And so we ran missions to support some Navy ships inland to support inland troops. So we're cruising up and down the coast with incursions from that standpoint.
Okay. And if I'm doing my math from a date time frame, we're talking 68, 69-ish?
69 to 70.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
And when you went, did you know it was going to be a 12-month tour?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, you didn't know how long, but that was just what was happening.
That was sort of the standard.
Yep.
Your orders likely suggested a duration, but everyone knows that they can be changed.
Here's your ticket. Get aboard and be quiet. And so it was good.
Okay.
But so it was a different mix for me, although I didn't have the perspective of people that went to other squadrons that were working out of, Da Nang and Quantico. It was something we did. So.
And what region of Vietnam were you supporting?
The entire coast.
Okay.
We had a couple of incursions where we went north of DMZ and feigned going into North Vietnam. It's all public now, but at the time it wasn't. So no different than our incursions at the south. But I was very fortunate. I didn't get to a great amount of conflict. There was a lot of diversion, a lot of capability, and we were just there. So
And what did the typical package for an incursion look like from a?
it varied.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was a recon team, sometimes it was a resupply, and it could have been parts. So
Okay.
it was.
And tell us a little bit about the size of your crew, and did you fly with same?
Yeah, you had a crew of 5 in those days. You'd have a pilot, a co-pilot, a crew chief, and 2 gunners. The typical crew for 46 is only 3 because you're not going to fly with gunners. Tough to land in Philadelphia with 2 gunners. It's just a little bit surprising to people, but quite seriously, it was a crew of 3.
Okay. That stayed integrated for most
No.
of it. Yeah, didn't really matter
You
whatever
look
the
at-
board said.
You go into the operations and, here's what the flight schedule is today. So always mix and match all the way around.
Yep. How many? Give us a sense of how many days on. Day missions, night missions.
7
any
days
rest
on,
cycle.
0 days off.
Yep.
For that particular time frame. And it didn't matter when. It was just, you looked at the flight schedule. We didn't do an awful lot of night flying unless there was some reason for it. But you didn't, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday didn't exist. It was just a constant thing that went.
Okay.
And sometimes you wouldn't be on a schedule. So, it could have been operations decide you need a day off. But
And on that, were there opportunities for liberty or rotations back to Okinawa for a little bit of?
as things were going along, the Mao at times, because the Navy needed their time off, and so they would say, "Oh, we got to go resupply and have some time off." Just before I got there, the Marine squadrons were kicked to the beach. They could continue to operate. I got there in time, so stay with us. There were number games being played by the whomever in charge. You can only have so many Marines on the board. You can only have so many Army. And so there's a numbers game in terms of that conflict. So they were trying to bring the numbers back down, so they just didn't want to have another few hundred stuck. So we stayed with the ship. One time we went back to the Philippines, and we went into Hong Kong, and we went to Taiwan. So you'd pull in for a couple of days, and that was non-flying. Other than the Philippines, we'd fly in and fly out of the base there. We'd continue to fly to stay current while the ship got resupplied, got fuel, got scrubbed down. 2 days later, we'd fly back on the ship and go with them. But that was very low-key, more recreational flying, we call it.
Okay.
Although we did lose a bird in the Philippines in a storm one time in our resupply, so unfortunately.
Crew make it out or no?
All but one made it out. So we then spent some time recovering and supporting that.
Yeah.
But those were the downtimes. We did go back to the Philippines at one point and got caught up in typhoon relief and flew down to the southern part of the island and were, again, doing something similar to what's happening in the Carolinas and Tennessee, where everything was just blown flat. And so we were bringing in rice and food and so forth. It was almost like I was hearing early in this last hurricane relief, and I mentioned it to my friend. I said, they're being told they can't go in, individuals to help, because somebody wanted to be in charge and show up and raise the flag or raise their hand and say, I'm bringing you help. That was happening there. We couldn't go in and drop supplies until the little mayor of that little community got aboard the helicopter and landed with us so he could stand on the steps and say, I'm bringing you rice and food stuff and so forth. It was frustrating, to say the least. Lost another bird there that backed into a helicopter dropping people off. So even in, I'll call it peacetime support activities, you still have some issues. So.
No, that's a great, reminder, and that there is some danger in the mission set that the military operates in, and that's not untrue for civilians, but slightly more elevated for the stuff we do.
Highlighted, I just saw in the news, they're searching for the crew the fighter that had to eject out by Mount Rainier. So here we got stateside, got some problems. I got a nice chute. Why don't I go out and take a ride? Then
Yep.
can't be found. So
Yeah. No. Yes. Okay. If you don't mind, talk to us a little bit about, give us a picture of living on a ship, the size of your quarters. You have to share it.
we're kind of in it. 6 of us in a small room, and now if I were a lance corporal down in the bowels, he'd simply say, "You're in heaven," compared to officers' quarters. But 3 racks, 6 feet long. I still had a 6'4" frame at the time, a little pipe around the edge with a little dip that you get in, a typical ship kind of bunk with a little mattress on it. So that was it. But we had a shower across the hallway with 5 stalls in it. And
Food, mess?
we joined the Navy mess. The joke was that when you join the mess, you buy in, you have to pay. And of course, the mess share is, way up here. By the time you leave the ship, they buy you back out. The share is way down here. It was really interesting how the Navy was able to manipulate the inventory that way. But it was interesting. You get into rough seas, the trays are going left and right, so it's
Dicey?
what's coming by you eat. So I didn't have any problem with it.
Good.
I never did.
And share with us communication to and from home. How did that work back in the old days?
Well, letter writing, and then I had a small little 3-inch tape recorder, and I would record some tapes, send them home. Had another recorder back home. My wife would listen to those with my son. But the letters would come stacked up. Sometimes they'd be 5-6 weeks late by the time they got to you, and then you'd get 5 or 7, whatever number was written.
And imagine similarly.
It wasn't like today where you see folks, pop up a little laptop and they've got a immediate connection and so on and so forth.
Nope.
And I wasn't flying high enough. We had high freq radios every now and then. If you got a chance to go to altitude, you might use that high freq and sneak a call back and have it relayed from an Air Force station, as a matter of fact.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. But a couple of times that happened.
Okay. You were there long enough for a couple holidays. Any stickouts from a Thanksgiving or Christmas meals, or how did the Navy?
Christmas down on the hangar deck with minister conducting services. No, they were just
Another day.
Another day, really.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, any other events or significant activities that we should talk about from that time?
No, just coming home.
Okay. Well, let's get to coming home. So how was that?
It was what everybody's read about. I came through San Francisco. Treasure Island is where you muster out. Because at the end of my tour, then I was getting off active duty. They'd shortened things down a tad, 3 months. And San Francisco was kind of a nest show with folks that were just not happy with the war effort. And we landed at the commercial airport. It wasn't, I did.
Wearing uniform and the full, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And another plane load of the 200 guys that you.
No,
and
I was on a commercial flight,
Okay.
so
Okay.
best of my recollection, But there were a number of us that were spaced around. But you still go through the terminal. So once we got through the terminal, that was fine. Got to Treasure Island, started mustering out. It's going to be a 24 or 36-hour process, a physical and orders and so forth. I went into San Francisco, and I was told to go to the Marine Corps Memorial Club, which still exists, beautiful facility, about 8-story building, and 3 or 4 floors are rooms. The top floor is a restaurant and a bar. And of course, I showed up there, and you walk through the door, and they just immediately know where you're coming from when they see you. And so you couldn't put your hands in your pocket to grab a credit card or a dollar bill or anything. So everything was fine. So they were happy to see us. So it was kind of like getting inside your own little club.
Yep.
There's a lot of memorabilia on the 2nd and 3rd floor. I visited it 5 years ago, and stayed there. You become a member, and
Right.
accommodations were nice. lots of memorabilia out there. So,
Okay.
so that was a nice part of the stay. Came back home, landed in Tampa, went down the causeway or the hallway, and it was interesting that the family was there. Funny story. The day before, my wife had wanted to make sure she knew where the airport was and how to get out there. Went out there with my son, who was 4, and they were walking down the hallway. Other military were walking. This Chuck ran running out to somebody yelling, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." This guy's heart just about fell out of his mouth, thinking,
I wasn't aware.
it's not me. Of course, Alice was upset too. Because that's just been a family laugh that we tell with Chuck.
Yes.
But
Neat of her to have been that proactive to think through, preparing and planning. I imagine that was an emotional reunion.
it was. But, you put it back, you pack up, make our next plan. So we left there and came up here to New England. My folks were still living in Northampton.
Is your wife from this area?
No, she's from Florida.
Okay.
She had been staying with her folks just outside of Tampa.
Okay.
That's where her home is. And but we came north. That's where I wanted to come back to. Had our place in Vermont, a family place that I love. I went looking for work. Ended up working at the University of Massachusetts in continuing education conference center, running conferences and programs. Went back to school, went into the MBA program at UMass, Eisenberg School of Management. Completed that. And so after 4.5 years, I was looking to move on to something else. And while I was at UMass, joined the Reserve Squadron in South Weymouth, which had Hueys. And of course, having come from a larger frame, airframe, the 46, I don't want to fly those little dinky things. That was all there was around. I would have had to go to Philadelphia to fly 46s. Joined the squadron, and turned out I stayed, down in South Weymouth until the mid-90s. So it worked out well.
And let's go back, or at least I'm curious about your path to the reserves. When you were separating in San Francisco, was that an option, something you were curious about, or at that point, like, I have done my time, I'm not...
No, as a matter of fact, just before I left overseas, I tried to augment what they call, so you go from reserve officer to regular officer. They were not taking any augmentations at the time. They were, again, the Marine Corps was trying to cut the numbers back down, or
okay.
Congress wasn't approving that level of staffing.
Okay.
So a year before that, it was like you had to, send the postcard in and say, I don't want to do it, or it was going to be automatic. So it flipped very quickly. So I just collected my thoughts for about a year. A good friend living in Northampton that I'd been with out in California. Just coincidentally, he was back living in Northampton. And we started chatting at some point. He said, you got to come down. I will. He finally got me to go down, and that weekend I decided to join. So then got into the reserve.
Okay.
Component.
And you stayed with Weymouth for the duration?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I retired out of Weymouth.
All right, tell us about the reserve path, like the expectations, how frequently you were there, the type of missions that they supported.
It was an interesting stay. Clearly, there was always the thought behind you that at some point you might get called up, but it hadn't been any real history of it, and nothing was happening at that point. So it was just a straight training type thing. Almost everybody there had come through the overseas package. And so you kind of say, this is a piece of cake compared to where we were before. So we were a bit more relaxed, I'll call it. Missions were just straight training, so you need to get your minimums at night, and instrument and formation, those types of things. Annual checks. So we'd fly at night, whenever they would. Wednesday night was a night flying night, and Friday night before a drill weekend was a flying. But there would be missions to go to air shows. There would be missions to transport people. We would pick up government officials that flew into Rhode Island, when we bring them to Boston. When the tall ships were in Boston, we got a mission for that week, fly the National Archives photographers around the harbor. Interesting, but you couldn't really look at the ships if you're flying because you don't want to hit a mast. So, but it was interesting flying.
Okay.
We did the blizzard of '78. I spent the entire week in Weymouth, flying, picking people up, taking them to the hospital for dialysis, that type of thing. That's a picture that will stick in my eye, just being in the air, looking down at interchanges with cars and trucks just frozen. It's like somebody snapped their fingers and cars were stopped. 128 was loaded. So that was quite a week.
Yeah, I believe it.
But we had training missions. We went to California, Florida, Washington. I flew the Huey back and forth across the country 7 times. I and the rest of the squadron that flew it. So that's an interesting deal in the middle of the summer. We don't have the range that a 135 does.
Lots of little stops.
It's a lot of stops and crew days get maxed out.
Okay.
But it was very interesting training throughout that. I will say the squadron did get called up during the Gulf War. They ended up backfilling over in Okinawa while that squadron then went in. I, at that time, had become commanding officer of the MAB squadron, which did not get called up. That was a Marine Air Base squadron. So we had food, crash crew, security, operations, and so forth.
Great.
All my helicopters left, so there was only a couple left to fly.
Yeah. That's a great segue because I'm curious to understand your professional promotion. Just clearly, you were an aviator, but were there other duties that you were asked to do, leadership positions along the way before you became commander, or how did you progress up the ranks?
Well, yeah, everybody has a secondary job. You happen to be a pilot, but you're going to get in administration or operations or maintenance, something. And I cycled through a number of different. I was hydraulics officer. I was the crash crew officer. In Weymouth, I was a safety officer, so I spent a month in Monterey, California, at the safety school, learning to be a safety officer. And, that's as much preventative as it is the crash investigation. I then, as I said, moved to MABS, which is a much more administrative job over there. But I never spent much time in operations. It was mostly maintenance. I was what they call a post-maintenance inspection pilot. Do check rides.
Check rides, yep. After they've fixed the issue or analyzed it. Okay. Any colleagues or leaders that stick out in your mind as particularly strong or impactful?
No, I think not really.
Okay.
They were all very good. Yeah. And the one that maybe wasn't, you don't want to talk about. So.
But you learn lessons from both sides of it.
Oh, you do. Yeah, you learn a lot of things. But you also bring something to it. I mean, as I just think back, my upbringing, as I said, my scout activities, my athletic team activities, you learn how to deal with a group. And then you see some folks that are very narrow, have a head down, don't get involved. They have difficulty assimilating into a military organization because it's a team effort. I didn't do anything by myself. It was all done with support and collaboration with somebody else.
Yep.
Which is kind of a lesson in life that we like to pass on to people.
Yep. No, I think the military does well at the leadership side, and to that point of it takes a team, and the understanding that all of us have a role to play, and we're all relying on each of those pieces to be there when we need it. And then the next step is to also recognize that you could be gone, whether it be deployment or other reasons, at a moment's notice. So you kind of got to know his job and be ready to fill in. So it's a great crucible, and I think, like you pointed out, does well to cross into lots of other roles. As a guy that recently retired and made that transition, it was slightly more challenging than I was expecting it to be, but proud that I found my path. Grateful for all the folks that helped along the way. Could you talk about your transition to your civilian career?
Sure. Sure. I just want to comment on what you were just mentioning, though. One of the first things I learned when I went out to the base in California, and I became, I think it was hydraulics officer at the time. The shop's the size of where we're sitting right now with maybe 5 guys in there. The first lesson was, if the gunny's in charge of the shop, you let him run it. You don't come in as a first lieutenant and say, hey, here's what you need to do.
I think we're doing this wrong, gunny.
That's right. So you just sit back and let him do the work. But second was turnover jacket, was the terminology that was used. And that was something that was in place at every element of the organization. And so when all of a sudden you're leaving, you have got this turnover jacket that you give to the person that's taking over, and they can go right down the list and say, here's what you do, and here's what you don't do, and here's where these things are. That concept that you just mentioned, you might leave any job at any point. Somebody that's following you in needs to have some guideline, something documented that helps them. So that's kind of stuck with me as I go along.
And more than that, but the training aspect, the mentorship side of, Jim, I need you ready to step into the interviewer role. So we're going to practice this a couple times. I don't want to be an interviewer, right? But I think it's good for your career, and there are ties, and I may not be here tomorrow.
That's right. Do it.
Yep. So.
Well, when I left UMass, I went to work for a trade association that represents the printing and packaging industry, and I went primarily from the HR standpoint, because my master's degree was in industrial relations, personnel industrial relations. And so when I joined the association, I was helping negotiate union contracts for groups, putting insurance programs together, dealing with people problems in companies. Pretty quickly that moved into becoming the assistant director, and 5 years after I joined, I became the president in charge of the association, which grew in size. We ended up having 600 plus companies across New England that were part of the association, and we provided management services, a wide range from certainly from the personnel industrial relations side, but to finance and to budgeting and to production standards and training. And so I stayed with them until I retired in 2012. Again, in parallel with doing the reserve activity, and learned quite a bit about the industry and structure, and marketing, sales, manufacturing, inventory, and knew a lot of companies. So when I retired, there had been a merger and acquisition firm that we'd used for presentations on a conference, and they'd do a session or a training program that we'd take around New England. And they kept saying, when you get out of there, why don't you come join us? So I retired in 2012 and joined New Direction Partners, which is an M&A firm that specializes just in the printing and packaging industry. And there are 9 of us now across the country. 4 partners that started the firm, and 5 of us that came along afterwards. I say I'm the pretty face. I just know people. Those are the folks with the real knowledge. But it's interesting, and a lot of transactions that are done with people looking to exit their company or looking to grow by acquisition. Mm-hmm. So I've learned an awful lot from those partners that I've worked with there. So that's what I'm doing for, in the off time when I'm not.
Yeah, and you're still actively playing with them.
I am playing with them, yeah.
No, I've seen you run off to a couple meetings, and always seem to still enjoy it. So.
It's an interesting, as more and more people are doing, it's interesting that we can become efficient and effective remotely. Mm-hmm. Zoom meetings and phone calls and, studying and reviewing financials and proposals and so forth. It's not something where you have to be in front of somebody all the time. So
right.
It's good.
Take me to when did you arrive in Westboro? So you got out. There was a Vermont phase, Weymouth.
No, I never lived in Vermont. When I left Northampton, worked at UMass from 71 to 76. Sold our house then, 77. We actually moved out. And I came here in July of 77. I'd started working for Pine January of 77, actually December of 76, but
Okay.
Beginning 77. Commuted for the 6 months, found a house here, same house I'm still in now.
Pretty awesome.
So
Okay.
a lot of people in Westboro say, you're not a Westboroite if you haven't been here 6 generations. So I'm not a Westboroite, there's no question about that.
I don't know. You've been here a while, so.
But very nice town, I love it.
And how, if you don't mind, tell us, your perceptions of how it shifted, grown, evolved over the time.
It's grown to a considerable different town than it was when I joined in 70. There was a lot of apple orchards, there were some farms, there was a lot of open space. It was quiet, and maybe like many towns, because I can't parallel it with other towns because I haven't lived there. It's grown, it's become more dense. I think that we're culturally, maybe all the way around us, because I've got a son living in Shrewsbury, I parallel what's happening there. I think we're just making it less affordable for people that are struggling. And I think that's unfortunate. I just don't think there's a way to simply say, okay, if you don't want to have this mega house, you can go over and have this, half a mega house.
Right.
Well, fewer and fewer and fewer of those around, which brings in a different class of folk. Mm-hmm. I'll just highlight back to when I was working in the youth hockey program. And we had to raise funds and we ran programs. We had a lot of fundraisers and the parents would get involved. And then slowly, and then there would be a fee. And slowly we began to see people joining. Would say, well, I can't help you with a fundraiser, I'll just pay a little more on the fee. And so the more we relied on the bigger fee and less fundraisers, some folks that couldn't afford the bigger fee kind of got pressured out.
Yep.
And they got excluded. And that's the dynamic that's in a microcosm, but if you expand that around, same was happening in other corners of the town. Do we need the services that we're looking at? Yes. Are they nice to have? Yes, they are. Town meeting coming up here in 2 weeks going to deal with 2 major issues, if not more. One that's close to our heart, which is the community center, and yet I've been looking at a community center when I was on the finance committee. Any expansion at the senior center or community center got pushed aside to get town hall, to get fire station, to get police station. All these other things took precedent, which also take dollars. I sat on the school renovation committee for losing it over on Fisher Street,
Gibbons.
You just see the dollars that it requires to put in the things that either code are requiring or community pressure is looking for.
Yep.
Just a very expensive process.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
That didn't succinctly answer your question.
No, I thought it did well, and as a relatively newcomer to Westboro, discovering it over the last 5 years, I think it is not surprised to hear that 50 years ago was much more of a rural, quieter, a more open space. It makes sense that the denser population, the affordable housing, I think is an issue across multiple towns,
Correct.
communities, at the micro and the macro level. I think that was part of what the MBTA zoning, pushing, encouraging folks along the commuter rail to make affordable housing and multiple family units, figure out a way to assist that population. So, and I think Westboro is wrestling with it, but as I drive around, I'm aware that there are still pockets where that exists. Is it getting harder? Yes. So, okay. Well, you've dabbled a little bit into some of your civic contributions. So you've always been civic-minded and shared your time and talents. Tell me how you joined the Westboro Veterans Advisory Board, how they found you, how you found them.
I woke up one morning and I was tied and shackled and drawn to. No, that's not true. It was an invitation letter that came from Ken Ferrara on the behalf of the board. I think Paul Horgan was probably behind that. Paul and I had kind of parallel activities go way back. He was a great supporter of hockey and the youth, and Sean, unfortunately, who just recently passed away, his son, and my son were at school around the same time, knew each other. But I think Paul was involved, and they were looking for people and suggested my name. No different than we at the table over the last few years have looked to get people that might be interested and involved. We look for more than just a name. We're looking for people that can do some lifting and coordinating.
Yeah.
And as you know, we've been successful in expanding the board size-wise with the approval of the select board. So,
Correct. Well, I think I've done it and tried to do it at the intro and a couple other times, but if you could share with the audience, what does the Veterans Advisory Board do, and how is it different from the American Legion or the VFW or other entities?
now, interesting expanded question. I think there certainly is some overlap to the American Legion, the VFW, and the DAV, and so forth. But the board, when I joined, was to support the activities of the veteran service officer, who is in place in every town to provide assistance to veterans, to access to benefits, services, housing, that type of thing. When I joined the board, Westboro had its own dedicated
VSO.
VSO. It was in the process of creating this district that now, that district represents 4 towns. So it's transitioned in the last 8 years. I think the board's mission then and today is to be certain that everything that can be done reasonably is done to inform veterans, to provide a welcoming spot for veterans, to bring them together to talk about what their needs are, and then finding solutions to those needs. I think a lot of veterans come to this town and every town and keep things buttoned up. They can't keep it quiet. Well, I need some help, but I'm not going to let somebody know about it. As is evidenced by the efforts to say to folks, if you need help, give us a call. The phone's not ringing off the hook. You've got to find a way to unlock that. So early on, the board helped in celebrating the holidays that we know, Veterans Day and Memorial Day. Provided some support to Ken when he asked for it. Began to expand to say, how do we get the word out there? Well, we got involved with a newsletter, and we got started with a Quilts of Honor, and we've gotten into other activities, cards at Christmas, and
Hometown Heroes banners. And
the banner program, what I saw many places and kind of brought to the table, and we got started.
Yep.
In spite of some hurdles. I think we're up to a point. I just laid the banners out on my floor. I've got 150 banners, I think, that we're going to be putting up next week that represent veterans and many deceased, family members, but it's a way of letting folks know that there is an atmosphere of support for veterans in this town. I think we both know that if we stopped 10 people on the street and asked them to tell me what a veteran is, half of them wouldn't be able to give you even a coherent bad answer.
Fair. So, and I'll take I like your definition of what the board does. I'll take it one step further and add a layer to that part of the education, the advocacy, and the outreach to, in particular, the policymakers of the community, but ideally the public at large to, this Veterans Corner to try and break down some of those biases and stereotypes and make a more informed public of what your service members are actively doing for you and what burdens the veterans have voluntarily taken on and still shoulder whether it be seen or unseen. So,
I agree with you. I'll go back. We know that we're not in a volunteer military these days. So people are making a choice to leave their normal course of action. Early on, I would grant. You don't have to be in a conflict to have made a sacrifice to come in and support the country. There are a number of branches. There are a number of, I'll call them professions within those branches to bring it out to the civilian world. But the MOS, as we know it, that list is very long.
yep.
So there are people manning communication stations, there are people in supply, there are people in development that are doing just as important work as somebody that's out driving a truck, driving a tank, flying a plane, aiming up a mortar. So
Yep.
we need to bring them back and celebrate them the same way.
Speaking of that, I've loved the conversation, but I think that's a great sort of jumping off point to what's next. We get to recognize a symbolic veteran for all that they've done for the community this coming Veterans Day. And Jim, you are our winner for Veteran of the Year for 2024 for lots of the work that you've done, the advocacy, the pushing, the awareness, the education, to inform and welcome and create a safe space to reach out for those veterans and their families. So well done. We look forward to the rest of the larger community to invite them out and join us. Before I give closing comments, is there anything that we've missed or anything that you'd like to share?
You've been very thorough and very kind. Thank you very much. I'm sure I probably went overboard in some explanations, but I think I would leave with the fact that it is a team effort, no matter where we are. Mm-hmm. No one individual does anything on their own. And so I'm just a representative, if you will, of what the advisory board and veterans on a greater scale in town are doing.
A proud tradition of service, of why we sort of call them as service members. So thank you. Well, to our audience out there in the virtual world, as we wrap up today's session, I'd like to remind our audience that our Veteran Service Officer, Jeff Farrell, maintains an office on the first floor of the town hall, and whose contact information can be seen on the screen at the end of today's show. Both he and the Veterans Advisory Board are here to help guide you to the resources and benefits that your uniformed service may have earned. A reminder again that Monday, November 11th is Veterans Day. Westborough's observance ceremony will take place at 10:30 a.m. in front of the Forbes building. We cordially invite you to come out and join us, where we'll have the opportunity to honor again and recognize the Veteran of the Year, Jim Tepper. And lastly, I'd like to thank Westboro Television for their continued support in putting this Veterans Corner together. A big thank you to Jim for coming out and sharing his story. And until next time, thank you for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful week.